Welcome to Echo, the podcast where we share our personal perspectives on questions about God, spirituality, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm Ryan Becker, your host. No matter who you are, we hope that you find value and encouragement through real discussions about real things. Let's jump in. Echo. Hey everyone, welcome back to Echo. I'm Ryan Becker, your host. Really glad that you are joining us today. I am joined by two awesome guests. One, a newer friend of mine, one of the students that I work with at Southern Adventist University. So we'll start, first of all, with introductions. Richie, let's start with you.
Sure. Richie Halversen. I'm the senior pastor at Bowman Hills Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Awesome. And then Derek, what about you?
My name is Derek Schreier. I'm currently a student at Southern, like you mentioned, and I'm actually from Asheville, North Carolina.
Cool. And Derek, what are you studying?
I'm studying business management currently.
Awesome. And what year are you right now?
I'm a freshman.
Okay, cool. So I'm excited to watch that major change like 6 times over the next 4 years.
I'm ready to change it.
So today we are talking about an interesting topic, one that isn't one that's so emotionally driven, but one I think that a lot of people encounter at some point. We talk about this term of biblical inerrancy, or the idea that the Bible contains no errors, and that has been a historical belief and system of beliefs that has come throughout the church's history. And today, I want to talk about this because there are things in the Bible that seemingly look like they're contradicting each other. And so when people see this, especially at a point where they're wondering, is God real? Is this true, right? They start reading the Bible and they might see something small. So they might open the Gospels, for example, and see that in each different Gospel, it's, who got to the tomb first is recorded differently. Things like that. It could be small, it could be big. And so today I want to talk about contradictions a little bit. I want to wrestle with that idea and maybe give people a new idea or a new perspective on how they can approach that topic. So when both of you hear the term, contradictions or the phrase contradictions in the Bible, what do you think of? What is the first thing that comes to mind?
It's probably the who gets to the tomb first and those different accounts. And they seem to contradict themselves. But as you study it and you read it, you realize that these are not just for eyewitness accounts, but it's 4 different perspectives. And so the Gospels are written with a certain story to tell. And so different storytellers choose to highlight certain segments, and they're not necessarily saying, okay, this is the way that it happened exactly as it happened. It is how it happened, but it's from a different perspective. And I know when I tell a story or I hear a story, I'm going to highlight something that struck me, the first thing that I noticed. In fact, when police get witnesses of a particular crime or something like that, people will remember little details that they saw when it happened, the color of that person's jacket or, this, and the other people don't remember that at all. But it's just because of what our perception is and what we really notice when it happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think witness testimony is huge, and especially in Scripture, it's huge. I know that somewhere in the New Testament, I'm blanking on the specific verse, but there's an instruction that says, if you're going to bring an accusation before an elder, you must do so on the account of 2 or 3 witnesses, right? It's the idea that multiple perspectives help us get a complete picture of what happened. Right. They help fill in those blanks. Derek, what about you?
Coming from a place of youthfulness, I think sometimes it's maybe a little less cut and dry than that. I know many times I've been studying the Bible or in class, and it just gets a little confusing, like what exactly is going on. But I remember last year when we went through the accounts of Jesus and stuff in Bible class, we really accented kind of what Gospels hit on what points. And like you mentioned earlier, it really was interesting what details get mentioned from each gospel to gospel. And it almost had to do with what background that account was written on. Like Luke, for example, was, kind of medically driven. So he might remember different things that had to do with that compared to other gospels that might focus on other things. So really contradictions, I feel are a lot about perspective, but it is challenging sometimes, I feel like, to find that without really putting in the study.
Well, let's ask this, right? You said it's not as cut and dry in that, and I think there are moments where that certainly is the case. So how have you wrestled with contradictions, or what impact have those seeming disagreements in Scripture had on your faith? And it's totally okay if that's negative right now. Like, that's totally fine. I think there are people that are in that spot. And so it's totally cool if that's the case.
I think for me personally, at first you believe the Bible, you believe that it's in harmony, and it's hard to wrap your head around maybe like a mistake or whatever, even just like fashion the idea. But I think once you go in and actually study it and really like see the perspective and like what the Bible is actually trying to say here, it almost adds to your faith in a way at the end of that study, to where at the beginning you're almost maybe a little bit confused. For me anyway, I feel like at the end of something like that, I even have more trust and more faith in the Bible based on what I've seen. And challenging it has almost been beneficial, even though it doesn't look like that at the beginning maybe of a study like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's been kind of a theme that's been mentioned on several episodes, but this idea that when you have a doubt or when you have something that you need to wrestle with, that you lean into it, because on the other side of it can be a stronger faith. And there are many moments like that where we look at contradictions, and the way that someone who is anti-Christian, right, they might look at those contradictions, and instead of asking the question, how are these harmonized, they might say, they might use them instead to justify their own anti-Christianity, right? Their own negative feelings. And so there is a lot of importance in the approach that we take when we see those moments in Scripture. So let's ask this: what do I do when I see things like that in Scripture? Any insights here on where do you begin?
Usually I begin just studying the Scriptures, looking at the context. I look up and research what different Christians have said on this. I try to study the context and just get a perspective. I mean, whether we want to admit it or not, we were raised through a certain cultural lens. And what we tend to do with Scripture is we want to apply our culture to the Scriptures instead of allowing the Scripture of the culture to apply to our lives. And so it's so important to me is to not only doubt our doubts, but to doubt our convictions a little bit, in the sense of, Nietzsche said that the greatest enemy of truth is conviction, because I can be so convicted on something and just ignore reality and not admit, okay, there seems to be a contradiction here. This doesn't seem God of love, and yet, wipe out an entire group of people. How do I reconcile that? And I think if we're not fair with the Scriptures and really dig deep into it and pursue the answer through prayer and Bible study, then usually we can give a pretty bad answer to someone who asks us those kinds of questions. So for me, it's just immersing myself in the Scriptures and coming to it, understanding, some of the things that I may have been raised believing, they may be right, they may not be right, or there just may be another thing that I can learn from this other than the way I've previously viewed it. So I think just being open and honest is the key. And really being willing to not only doubt my doubts, but doubt my convictions.
That's really good. I can resonate a lot with that for sure. Derek, any thoughts here?
I mean, I think we do sometimes look at the Scriptures with a little bit of bias, even though we don't want to. Like you pointed out, it's easy to read a text and apply it how you benefit personally from it. So a lot of times it's hard to take that step back and look at Scripture from really just like as an unbiased lens as possible. But as you pointed out, it's kind of essential, I think, to figuring out some of those hard texts.
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect to this as well, and that's the community aspect to it, right? I think sometimes we err too much on the side of telling someone to just dig deep into Scripture, But if they don't have the right tools to understand it, they'll just keep reading the same line over and over and not know what to do with it. And I think I remember a time where I did a 2-part sermon series on Nehemiah 1 and his prayer in Nehemiah 1. I analyzed both his approach to prayer and then his actual breakdown of the prayer, like his method of prayer. And so that was over the course of 2 weeks at one of my churches. And a member came up to me afterwards and she said, Pastor, for the last 6 months, I've been praying. This was kind of funny, but she said, I've been praying, asking God to teach me how to pray. And then you preached these 2 sermons, and they were everything that I was looking for, right? I resonate so powerfully with this idea of prayer because God will answer. God is faithful to answer prayers. And when we give it to the community, right? This is the point of being in a community, is that you can ask the tough questions to them. You can wrestle with the text together. You can get different perspectives and different ways of viewing it that you didn't have. And perhaps come across someone, maybe it's even your pastor in church on Saturday morning, who says something that was exactly what you'd been looking for all along. And so it's this idea of you don't just isolate yourself away, right? Because that's the problem with the contradictions themselves, is sometimes we see them isolated. So then we isolate ourselves expecting to wrestle with them, and it doesn't work that way. So wrestling with them through community and being around people that you can ask those honest questions to, I think is incredibly valid and important. Absolutely. So to someone who may be thinking, who may have seen those contradictions, may have tried to study them and can't really reconcile, for example, the God of love that you seemingly see in the New Testament versus the God of, war and destruction that you seemingly see in the Old Testament, which obviously that's a vast oversimplification of it. But there's a lot of people that see that. So they see that and they go, or something like that, and they say, I don't know if I can do this. What do you say to someone who's in that position or in that place?
I know for me, I just, I avoid getting defensive and with people. I think that's kind of sometimes a knee-jerk reaction, is to just kind of rush to defend the scriptures. And I heard someone say once, the scriptures will defend themselves, you know. And so I think to not, that's the first thing, is not to get defensive or get kind of an attitude of with the individual who's asking. I think just really embracing that question and encouraging questions, and I think also at times, admitting where, what, that's a good question, I don't know, or I've thought this myself, and just being real about some of these things. There are some things in the Bible that we're just not going to know, but I don't believe that's a good excuse to not, just really pursue an answer. And I think that's the key. We'll say things like, "Oh, just you don't have faith," but reality, we need real faith pursues an answer, and it looks for evidence, and there is evidence in the scripture. So for me, it's to just really embrace people who ask questions and to not treat it as though questions are bad. In faith, every time I have questioned it, it has driven me closer to God on the other side of it. And so I think we need to treat questions as good things, as chances to dialogue over God, and to really look at it. And then you look at all the different evidences and you look at all the facts. And I believe on the other side of that, and it may take weeks, months, it may even take years of just wrestling with this idea, I believe on the other side of that, God wins and will give the individual enough to know that God is not a God of contradiction or confusion,
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more. Honestly, I think sometimes our knee-jerk reaction of disagreement is what drives someone away, more so than the contradictions themselves or the doubts themselves. One of my closest friends is in ministry and a Christian today because over the course of his 10-year journey where he left the faith, there was one pastor who just would sit down at Buffalo Wild Wings with him every once in a while, and they would just talk, and there was no pushiness, there was no defensiveness. It was just, I want to stay connected with you. And over the course of 10 years, when my friend was ready to step back into the picture and ask some of those questions again, guess who he went to, right? So it's this idea of being friends with someone along their journey and just letting them have it. I think sometimes, or what this makes me think of is if you've ever had a friend who's dating someone that they shouldn't be, and you try and tell them, like, this is a bad idea, don't do this, and they do it anyway. Sometimes when people get locked in on something, there's no stopping them. There's only loving them through it. And in many cases, I think doubts are one of those journeys.
I want to point back or go back a little bit and talk about kind of, I feel like, an important part of studying contradictions. It really takes an act of humility to admit that you don't know something. And I feel like that's a really crucial part in really reading the Bible or doing anything, is, like you said, using that community and coming from a place of humility and just saying, like, hey, I don't know what this is talking about, or this is confusing to me. It's not easy to do that sometimes, and especially with people who are maybe pretty highly educated or stuff, it's hard to come from that place of humility, like, I don't really understand this. And it's hard to engage that community without that principle of humility, I feel like. So I don't know. I just found that
that's
an
huge.
Interesting part of.
And in Adventism, that's hard because we like being right. There's a lot of people who I've said this before. This is kind of you're addicted to being right, and so struggling with something that you might be wrong on or don't know. Well, that's unacceptable because we have the truth. So for some people, that can be much harder than others. I think one of the other things that's worth pointing out about contradictions is. Many times, the contradictions that we see in Scripture are simply like tiny factual disagreements that don't actually conflict with the overall point of the story, right? So we talk about who got to the tomb first. The point of those stories is that the tomb was empty, right? That Jesus rose, and that is the consistent portion. Sometimes we look to poke holes in something instead of looking for what is in common here. What are these stories as a whole trying to tell me? And now for the bigger questions, obviously there are some contradictions or seeming contradictions that we have to wrestle with no matter what, because they do affect the overall narrative of Scripture. They may impact your view of what a loving God looks like or what salvation looks like. But for many, I think we get caught up on these tiny factual errors in a book that has been translated countless times, in a book that has been passed down throughout all of history. And yeah, a factual error may slip in here or there because God works through a broken people to present and push his perfect message. And he has always been faithful to preserve the core of that perfect message. So I think that is something that is absolutely worth pointing out. It's something that helped me a lot on my journey as well, and got rid of some of the animosity that I used to have towards Scripture because of the contradictions. So anything else to add on this?
I just think that what you said about the story is so key. We tend to compartmentalize Scripture. We'll read a little verse or we'll put it on a mug somewhere and, a little inspirational tidbit without applying it to the overarching narrative. The Bible is a story, first and foremost. It's not a book of morality. It's not a book of rules. I mean, it has the morality in it. It has things in it, but it is a grand narrative. And I think reading Scripture without compartmentalizing and just really studying the story. How does this fit into the story? How does this drive the story? That's the way we need to study Scripture. One of the biggest verses, I know the plans that I have for you. You get that. I mean, every graduation card has this on it, that God's going to prosper you and you're going to do well. But that verse in Isaiah was not about Israel going through a graduation. Israel was going to exile. God was letting his people go into exile of Babylon. And so when you really study that verse in the right context, it's not, all of your plans will work out and life will just be great. It's, man, even when bad stuff happens and God seemingly is nowhere to be found, he's going to prosper you. He's going to bring you out on the other side of this. And so I think that's another very important part of working through some of the contradictions is, God is a God of love. How does this fit into the gospel narrative, which is what the Bible is about?
Yeah, that's huge. Jeremiah 29:11 is one of my favorite verses for this reason, because people do use it. They use it as they're going into something good, but that verse is given as they're going into something bad. And what Jeremiah, I think it's 29:13, just two verses later, or maybe it's verse 12, it says, you will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart. And sometimes I think, especially nominal Christians or nominal Adventists will claim 29:11, but we won't claim 13, right? We won't claim the seeking part. We don't want to do that. We just want God to prosper whatever we want to do. And that's part of that confirmation bias, or that bias that we pull into Scripture to say, I'm looking for specific things that will enhance my worldview, or that will bolster and justify my worldview. That's huge. Derek, any final thoughts that you want to add here?
Yeah, I think just wrapping up, I feel like challenging these contradictions and looking at, does this little detail affect my faith? Like you guys pointed out, like, does this like just add something to the story, or is this a complete game changer? Like looking at those details really like helps you understand the context, I feel like. And essentially I feel like all the things you pointed out, like just kind of help you understand the Bible better, and like how contradictions go in like a bad way. I think it's interesting that there's also that other side, like you guys are pointing out. Like sometimes we misinterpret a text that we, stamp everywhere for something else. So I feel like it goes both ways, but sometimes we don't like to talk about the ways that, look nice. So anyway.
Everyone likes a little bit of drama.
Yeah.
So we tend to focus on the things that cause controversy. It's just true. Well, thank you guys so much for your insights here and your opinions. I really appreciate you sharing your journeys. And for our listeners, if you're in a place where you're wrestling with contradiction or doubt, understand that it's totally okay to be there. You are not the first one to be there. Just open up the book of Psalms or Lamentations or Ecclesiastes, anywhere. Just open any book and you will find doubt laced all over Scripture. The very people that walked with God doubted him. So this doubt is a normal part of this journey, and if you're there, it's okay. If you've been there for a while, it's still okay. We want to encourage you on that journey to keep moving forward, to keep searching, and to keep asking questions, and to keep praying as well. Thank you to Southern Adventist University for hosting us and allowing us to record Season 2 on their campus. And if you want to engage with anything more Echo podcast related or with the Project Refresh, you can head over to theprojectrefresh.org. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Echo. We hope you enjoyed it. To stay up to date with new episodes as we release them, and for more awesome content from Project Refresh, a ministry of the Carolina Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button below. And don't forget to like and leave a comment.